All right, we're back on Pinterest. So we're going to type vintage poster design. Do you ever just walk past an old poster, something that's vintage style, or maybe it actually is vintage from that particular time period, and it just makes you stop? There's something about it that draws you in. That's what I want to talk about in this video. What is it about vintage poster design that makes us stop and just kind of pause, pull it in, and reflect? Is it our own experiences? Is it something that is kind of speaking to us from the past? And then also, how does it affect us in terms of how we respond to it? And how do we recreate something like that using modern tools? Before we get started, please make sure you are subscribed to support the channel. A large percentage of people who watch these videos are not actually subscribed to the channel, so please subscribe. It really does help me out. So let's address the first part of this video, which is why are we drawn to vintage design? I think part of it really is nostalgia based, even if it's not from a time period that we lived in. It's really strange. I wasn't around in the 1930s Paris cafe scene, but you show me an old Art Deco style poster from that time period, and suddenly I want to be there. Vintage design really does have this honesty to it. The typography was bold, the colors were limited because printing was expensive, so designers had to be really intentional. You can almost see the brush strokes and the imperfections in the printing, and all of those things makes it seem human. With our modern tools now, everything is so pixel perfect, everything is so buttery smooth with vector art graphics, and that's great, they definitely have their place. But when it comes to creating authenticity, sometimes dirty just feels right. Dirty feels lived in. And maybe that's the big thing. It feels human, handcrafted, like someone made it, and not an algorithm. How does vintage poster design impact us? When we see a vintage poster, our brains read it differently than a modern ad. Modern poster designs are sharp, polished, high resolution, and we're expecting it to sell us something. Vintage design feels more like a story. Those imperfections, they're charming, they slow us down. A frayed edge or faded color can trigger curiosity. Who made this? Where has it been? It's less about the product and more about the feeling that it gives you. It's kind of like vinyl records. Sure, streaming is convenient, but vinyl makes you feel the music differently. Vintage design does that with visuals. Let's take a look at one of these vintage concert posters right here. What I love about this is not only the imperfections across the entire design itself, but also the colors and the way that they use the cutouts for like the heads right here and these shapes and colors. These are elements that you just don't see in modern designs. It's also obvious that when this was printed, it even looked imperfect. And that adds to the handmadeness, if that's a word, and just kind of shows how genuine this is. Somebody intentionally made this. They planned it. They kind of conceived of it. They planned it. They drafted it. Then they put it together using the tools and all of the different elements that they had. And this was not put together using a computer. Can you do something like this with a computer and make it look authentic? Almost. You can get very close to that line, and I've even seen some designs that people have done in the past where it legit looks like it was actually done by hand, but it was actually done on a computer. And that's something that I strive for when I do my vintage concert style posters, is I'm always trying to find new methods that make it look like it was actually made in the 1970s or the 1980s, whatever they are. And a really big part of all of that is the nostalgia factor. Seeing a vintage style poster, regardless of the topic or subject matter, it actually does make you feel something. You can long for that period or just have fond memories of that period just based on seeing this particular poster. There could be many different reasons why we're drawn to vintage poster designs, but I think the biggest reason is that we are familiar with it because we're familiar with those little things that we saw as kids. We might see one little element, some kind of a design element in a vintage poster that reminded us of something that we saw as a kid, and we immediately tie our memory to that poster. That kind of thing happens to me all the time because I notice those little tiny details. And I even made a video that's kind of related to that subject, so check that out right up here if you haven't seen it. So, how do we create vintage design with modern tools? Well, here's the cool part. We have better tools at this point in time to actually make something look authentic and vintage without looking fake. If you're in Photoshop or Illustrator, start with your type and don't just pick a retro font. Really look at the era that you're inspired by. Whenever you look for 1980s typography, you're going to find something that is somebody's interpretation or idea of the type of fonts that they used back in the 80s. And that's just not the case. Back in the 80s, sans serif typography was very popular and it wasn't large and flashy like something that you would see in a Google image search. So let's take a look at that right here. If you type in 1980s typography, you're going to see all of this really cool retro-inspired typography with all these different effects and everything. And it is really cool. I'm not knocking it, but this is not 1980s typography. Instead of typing 1980s typography, type in 1980s magazine ads. Doing this is going to give you a much better idea of the style of typography that was used in the 80s. So take a look at this. Here is a nice big chunky slab serif font, and you've also got right here a nice clean sans serif font that's going with this. Obviously, this does not look like anything on this page. And on this Tab magazine ad, you can see that they're using very clean typography. This is actually avant-garde. But pay attention to these types of details. If you're wanting something to look like it was from the 80s, you have to actually use this type of typography rather than this type of typography. This kind of design certainly has its place, but not when you're trying to make things look authentic and real from that time period. You also want to be very careful and intentional with your color palette. You actually want it to be very limited because old printing techniques could not handle a million shades, so stick to maybe 3 to 5 colors. And color palettes can also be a little bit tricky because if you type in vintage design color palette, 1980s color palette, whatever it might be, it's going to be a modern interpretation of the colors that were used in that time period. So instead of typing vintage poster design color palette or vintage color palette, try this instead. Whatever era you're going for, try 1980s interior design. So this will give you a much better idea of the type of colors that were actually used in that time period. So for example, the decorations actually used in this photo are a little bit of a modern interpretation of what was actually used, but the colors are accurate. So what you'd want to do is save this image probably to your desktop and then go over here to coolors.co/image-picker and we'll go right here to browse image and we'll just upload this image and you can just kind of play around and extract a color palette from here. So something like this is very 1980s, probably early 80s. You didn't get into a lot of bright neon colors until about the mid 80s and that lasted until about the early 90s. And you can also obviously manually do something like this where you bring it over here, like I want that shade, I want this purple right here, and just kind of play around with it on your own and figure out what kind of color palette you're going for. And again, it's not to say that these colors don't have their place, it just depends on what you're doing. And one particular area where vintage poster design really shines is in the texture, all the way down to the paper that it was printed on. Going back to the 90s and even further back than that, printing was a lot less perfect than it is now. Now we can get it exactly the way that we want it, but it used to be imperfect, and that's what gave it its human touch. So how do we give it that imperfect human touch? Well, we can actually use different techniques in Photoshop, and I've covered that in several different videos across the channel. So I'll go ahead and give you a quick example along with a few tips and tricks. So whenever you lay down type in Illustrator, the default color is going to be 100% black. So what we want to do is double click on this and we'll go over here to our black and just raise it up to about 10 to 15%. It's going to depend on the background that you've got, but we'll go ahead and just use 13% for now. So I'm going to copy this and now we're going to bring this into Photoshop and we're just going to paste as a smart object and hit OK. And let's zoom in to 100%. And one thing you have to remember is that a vintage style poster is going to be faded over time. So what happens to paper when it fades over time? It becomes more and more yellow. So what you want to do is lay down a solid color layer. And we're going to come over here to kind of a yellowish tint right here. But it doesn't have to be something like this. Obviously, that's way too much. So what you want to do is go to about maybe 5 to 6%. It just kind of depends on the textures that you've got going on. So I'm going to hit OK. And I have a collection here of paper textures. So I'm just going to open one of these. And we're just going to drag this on top of here. And I'm going to rotate it to where it'll fill out our entire document. All right, so I'm back to 100%. And we're just going to use a blending mode, probably multiply or darken. And so we've got a nice aged look here when it comes to the paper itself. It's a little bit yellowed, it's got some texture to it, but the problem is that type still looks very sharp. It doesn't look like this was printed back in the 80s, 90s, or really any other time other than today. So what we're gonna do is select our type layer here, and I'm gonna go up here to Filter, Blur, and Gaussian Blur. And we only need a little bit, so maybe between 1 to 2 pixels or so. And this is a serif type, so it's going to be a little bit trickier. So I'm going to do something like 1.5 pixels. So that gives it kind of a softer edge to make it look like it's kind of bleeding into the paper a little bit more. But we're not done yet. There's still something about it that's not exactly authentic feeling. So what we're going to do is I'm going to add a grain layer on top of here. We're going to fill this with 50% gray and hit OK. And now I'm going to go up here to Filter and Camera Raw Filter. So we're going to go over here to Effects, and we're going to add some grain. So I'm going to go 50. I'll just go 50 with everything, just make it easier. I'm going to hit OK. And now our entire document has a grain that's going across everything. So what we need to do is apply this layer to every layer underneath it. So we're going to change the blending mode to Overlay. And if you zoom in right here, you can actually start to see some of that grain happening right here. And this is also the reason why we don't have 100% black. Let me show you what happens if we add a color overlay of 100% black. We can't actually see any of those grain effects. So here it is with, and here it is without. You can actually see that grain layer happening, but you can't see it if it's 100% black. So even with adding that grain layer, we're not completely done yet. What I'm gonna do now is go up here to Filter, Distort, and Displace. So this is going to allow us to bring an image in and apply some textures based on that image. And the horizontal and vertical scale is how much that is actually being applied to our layer. And we only want a little bit of imperfection. We don't want a lot. You have to remember that when the ink hit the paper with Vintage Design, it still hit where it needed to hit, but it also bled a lot more. So we just need a horizontal and vertical scale of 1 for each one, and I'm just going to leave these settings right here. So we're going to hit OK, and now this is going to tell us to go choose an image to apply this filter. So I actually have a few in here. So we've got some ink smears, just kind of random ink smears, and that will be applied randomly to our type. So let's go ahead and click on Open, and it's doing that displacement there. And as you can see, it's very, very slight. So little things like this just help to contribute to make it look a little bit more aged than it actually is. And now one last thing we're going to do is that type faded over time with these posters because the entire poster faded. So we're going to double click on our layer, and we're going to use Blend If, and we're going to make sure that this is set to gray. We're going to go down here to our underlying layer, and I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and click on this left caret right here. And depending on your artwork, it will fade a little bit more or less depending on how high that number is. So we only want a little bit of it to fade, and we'll hit OK. And let's go back in to about 200%. And I'll go back into this to give us a little bit more fine detail. Let's pay attention to that G right there. And if you want it to be really faded like this, you can bring it further over to the left. But if you want just a slight fade, and go probably around 249 or so, and just hit OK. Now let's say that you wanted to reapply a displacement filter. Well, you can do that because this entire thing is a smart object. So all we have to do is go over here to Displace, click and hold this, and just drag it to the trash, and it removes that effect. So if you want to redo it with a different image, we'll go ahead and do that. And I'm going to use this top one right here. And this gives us a much better consistent distressed look all across the board. Now, like I said a minute ago, this is still a vector smart object. So what's awesome about this is that we can double click on this. It'll take us back to Illustrator, and we can actually change the type of this and click on Save, go back into Photoshop, and it will update the type along with all of those effects that we did. So whenever possible, keep your type editable in Illustrator unless you have to create outlines. One last thing to remember, and this is very important, is the layout of vintage poster designs. It is very different from what we see in modern design. They often had very symmetrical or very bold and centered compositions. Modern designs can tend to be all over the place, but vintage poster designs actually felt intentional. There was a reason why that element was put there, and it was put there because it was done by hand. Everything had to be so much more thought out because you just couldn't move around things as easily as we can today on the computer. So when considering all of these things put together, the trick is to not overdo it. You're not trying to make it look like it came out of a time machine, you're trying to make it look like it could have. So the next time you see a vintage poster, take a second and really look at it. Notice the colors, the type, and the texture. If you're a designer, steal a few tricks from it. Not to copy it, but just to capture the emotion. Because honestly, that's what good design is. Whether it's brand new or 80 years old, the idea behind it is to make you feel something. All right, I'm curious, what is your favorite era of poster design? Let me know in the comments below. I could seriously geek out about this all day. I really hope this video was helpful to you. If it was, please make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.